Amani Montgomery's heart raced as she entered the polished marble lobby of Hancock Trust Bank. The grandeur of the space, with its mahogany paneling and soft lighting, screamed old money and exclusivity. She straightened her back, forcing her nerves to settle. This was her first independent banking experience, one she had been looking forward to all week. At just 14 years old, she had earned a $5,000 scholarship for her academic achievements, a reward that reflected her diligence and the sacrifices her family had made. Her father, Dr. Josiah Montgomery, had raised her to appreciate the value of hard work and education. He always said that true wealth was found in knowledge, not possessions. This scholarship wasn't just a check, it was a symbol of her future. "I've got this," she whispered to herself as she approached the teller counter. She had practiced her deposit speech over and over, and she was ready. Amani was dressed in her Westridge Academy uniform, a navy blazer, skirt, and sensible loafers, a stark contrast to the designer attire worn by many of the bank's clientele. She slid her neatly prepared documents, the scholarship check, ID, and award letter, across the counter to the teller, Miss Donovan. Amani smiled politely, but the smile faltered as Miss Donovan's eyes dropped to the check. She looked at it, then back at Amani. A flicker of suspicion crossed her face, and Amani felt the warmth of her nervousness turning to discomfort. "That's a rather large check for someone your age," Miss Donovan said, her voice rising just enough for nearby customers to hear. Amani's heart sank. "It's an academic scholarship," she explained, trying to sound calm. "I have the award letter right here, if you'd like to see it." But Miss Donovan didn't take the letter. Instead, she set the check under the fluorescent light, rotating it as though inspecting it for signs of forgery. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one feeling like a weight pressing down on Amani's chest. She had done everything by the book, there was no reason for this. She was only here to deposit the check, nothing more. Without a word, Miss Donovan pressed a button under her counter. Moments later, the bank manager, Victoria Hargrove, appeared. Amani had seen her before, always impeccably dressed, always with a stern expression. Victoria glanced at Amani but didn't acknowledge her presence. She focused on the check. "What is this?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp. "It's my scholarship check," Amani repeated, trying to keep her composure. Victoria didn't even look at Amani. "We've had issues with fraudulent checks recently," she said dismissively, her eyes scanning the document. She turned to Miss Donovan and ordered, "Call security. We need to verify this." Amani stood frozen as a security guard approached. His eyes, like Victoria's, seemed to size her up, as if she were a problem to be dealt with, not a customer with a legitimate transaction. He gripped her arm, not gently, and began to escort her away from the counter. "Stand here," he said gruffly, pointing to a corner near the entrance. The moment they reached the corner, Amani felt the weight of every eye in the room. The whispers started almost immediately. She could hear the condescension in the voices, feel the judgmental gazes of the bank's well-dressed patrons. It was a humiliation she hadn't expected when she walked in that morning, filled with nervous excitement. Victoria Hargrove stood at the counter with her arms crossed, watching Amani with a look of satisfaction. "You'll stay here until we've completed our verification," she called out over her shoulder. Her voice dripped with disdain. Amani's heart raced as she glanced around. Her ID, her scholarship check, everything had been taken from her. She had no way to reach her father, he would be expecting her home soon, and she hadn't been able to contact him. Her phone was at school, left behind during study hall. "Please, I just need to call my father," Amani pleaded. Her voice cracked with the weight of her frustration. "I left my phone at school. I can't leave without it." Victoria ignored her, walking past with an air of finality. "Not our problem," she said without even glancing back. Amani felt her stomach twist in knots. She hadn't wanted any of this. She hadn't come here to cause trouble, just to deposit a check, like any other customer. Yet here she was, isolated, humiliated, and powerless. She stood motionless in the corner, watching the minutes tick by on the clock. Each second felt like an eternity, each whisper from the wealthy clients around her a reminder that she didn't belong here. The minutes dragged on, each one slipping by with excruciating slowness. Amani stood in the corner, her legs beginning to ache, her body growing stiff from the forced stillness. She didn't dare move, not with the security guard standing nearby, his eyes trained on her every step. Around her, life at the bank continued without interruption. The sound of keys clicking, the murmur of conversations, the gentle chime of the door opening and closing, all of it seemed to mock her helplessness. Amani glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been nearly an hour. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. Her father would be expecting her soon. What if something happened to him? What if he tried to call her and couldn't reach her? What if the worst happened, and she couldn't get to him in time? She pushed the thoughts away. She had to remain calm. But how could she, when she felt so small, so insignificant in this moment? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Victoria Hargrove was walking toward her, her designer heels echoing in the silence. She approached slowly, her expression cold, calculating. Amani tensed, but she refused to shrink under the weight of the woman's gaze. "You're still here," Victoria said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I thought you might have learned your place by now. But I guess some people just need a little extra time to adjust." Amani felt the sting of the words, but she refused to let Victoria see how much they hurt. "I just want to leave," she said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. Victoria's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Oh, you'll leave. But not until we're done with you." She glanced over at the security guard. "Make sure she stays here. Don't let her leave without my permission. We need to finish verifying everything." The guard nodded, his grip on his baton tightening. Amani's heart pounded as she watched Victoria walk away, her presence hanging in the air like a storm cloud. But then, something unexpected happened. As Victoria turned her back, Amani's gaze caught sight of a woman working behind the counter, Melody Pham, a young Asian-American teller who had been on shift since the morning. Melody had been glancing at Amani intermittently, her eyes filled with something that resembled sympathy. But every time their gazes met, Melody quickly looked away, clearly aware that even the smallest sign of rebellion could cost her job. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, Amani noticed something different now. Melody seemed to be watching her with more intent, more concern. Amani tried to hold back her tears, but they threatened to spill over. This wasn't right. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal, forced to stand in a corner while the world moved on without her. And then, almost imperceptibly, Melody moved. She walked past Amani's corner, her body angled slightly away from the security cameras. As she passed, she bent down, as though picking up something off the floor. Amani's heart skipped a beat when Melody's voice came in a quiet whisper. "Are you okay?" Melody asked, not looking at her directly but speaking low enough to be heard only by Amani. "You've been standing there for hours. This isn't right." The unexpected kindness nearly broke Amani's composure. She nodded slightly, her voice hoarse. "I don't know what to do. They took my phone. I can't call my father, and I've been here for so long. They won't even let me leave." Melody's expression softened, and for a moment, it seemed like she was going to say something more, but then she looked over her shoulder, ensuring no one was watching. "I can't give you my phone," she whispered urgently. "But I can slip it to you, quickly. Just don't let anyone see." She reached into her pocket, and in the next moment, Amani felt a small, familiar device pressed into her hand. "You only have a minute, okay? If they catch me, I could lose my job." Amani's heart surged with gratitude. She didn't even know how to express how thankful she was for this simple act of rebellion, for the courage Melody had shown in doing what was right. She nodded, whispering a quiet, "Thank you," as she clutched the phone against her chest. With trembling hands, Amani quickly dialed her father's number. The phone rang twice before his deep voice came on the line. "Hello?" Dr. Josiah Montgomery's voice was calm, reassuring, even over the phone. But Amani could hear the underlying concern in it. "Dad," she whispered, barely able to contain her emotions. "I'm at the bank. They won't let me deposit my check. They took my ID, my documents, everything. They've been treating me like I'm a criminal. I'm scared, Dad. I've been standing here for hours, and I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Amani could feel her father's composed demeanor slip slightly, his concern turning to quiet fury. "Stay calm, sweetheart. I'm on my way," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "I'm not far. I'll be there soon." "Dad, there's more," Amani continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I saw the bank manager, Victoria. She was meeting with a man named Harrison Wells. They were talking about my dad's company. They were planning something. She gave him a folder with Montgomery documents, Dad. Confidential ones. They're trying to sabotage you." For a long moment, there was silence on the line. Then her father spoke, his voice tight with control. "Are you absolutely certain about that, Amani?" "I'm sure," she replied, her voice steady despite the shock she was feeling. "I saw them. I wrote everything down. I've been documenting everything. I have proof, Dad." Dr. Josiah Montgomery's next words were deliberate and calm. "Good work, Amani. Don't worry. Help is on the way. Just stay where you are. Keep your head down and don't let anyone know who you are. I'll be there soon. Trust me." "I will," Amani whispered, her heart swelling with pride and fear all at once. The line went silent, and Amani, clutching the phone, tucked it back into Melody's waiting hand. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But despite the fear, there was something else rising within her, a sense of purpose. Her father would come, and this injustice would end. She had the evidence, and the truth would come to light. The air in the bank felt thicker now, charged with a quiet energy that Amani could almost taste. Time moved differently in that corner, where she stood, eyes glued to the clock on the wall. She was no longer just a helpless victim to the system, but someone who had a part to play in its eventual undoing. Her hand still shook from the adrenaline, but the feeling of agency was slowly replacing the dread. She had done something. She had seen something. And now, the only thing left was to wait for her father's arrival. As she stood there, eyes locked on the floor to avoid the stares of passing customers, she couldn't help but notice the contrast between how she was being treated and how others were being ushered through. The elderly white man who had been waiting patiently at the counter, his folder of papers neatly arranged before him, was suddenly treated like royalty. Victoria herself, who had completely ignored Amani when she had approached the teller, now glided over to the man, smiling warmly and offering him a seat. "Mr. Garrison, please allow me to walk you to the VIP room," Victoria said, her voice dripping with faux kindness. "We wouldn't want to keep you waiting any longer." Amani's chest tightened as she watched the man nod, his every need attended to while she remained in the corner, barely acknowledged. The contrast was stark. The other customers, mostly white, were served promptly and with exaggerated courtesy. The well-dressed woman who came in a few minutes ago, who clearly belonged to the upper crust, was given the royal treatment. No questions asked. No scrutiny. Just pure, unadulterated privilege. And there she was, a 14-year-old girl with a scholarship, standing in a corner like a criminal, her every move monitored by a security guard who seemed to grow more irritated with each passing minute. Amani's thoughts were interrupted by a small sound, Melody. The young teller had returned to her station, but she wasn't looking at the customers anymore. She was looking at Amani. Her eyes held something: sympathy, concern, maybe even a little fear. Melody had already done something incredibly risky by giving her the phone, but the girl seemed to sense that the situation was escalating. She was growing more uncomfortable by the minute, and Amani could see it. Amani offered a small, quiet nod in Melody's direction, but the teller's gaze shifted quickly to Victoria, who was now standing with another wealthy client, directing them to the VIP lounge. The tension in the bank felt palpable. Everyone was moving, but none of it was for Amani. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. As her father's words echoed in her mind, she found herself becoming more resolute. Just stay calm. Keep your head down, and trust that help is coming. It was nearly 3 p.m. when her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't her father. Instead, it was a text message from Melody. They've started the paperwork to cover their tracks. They know something's coming. Stay quiet. Amani's heart raced. The realization of what Melody meant, what was happening right in front of her, was almost too much to process. The people around her were already trying to cover up the injustice. But Melody's message gave her a new sense of urgency. She had to be ready when her father arrived. She had to make sure the evidence she had gathered wouldn't go to waste. Minutes later, as she continued documenting the events in her notebook, a sharp voice rang out across the room. "Get out of the way." It was Victoria again, now speaking to an elderly black man who had been quietly waiting by the counter. "I'm afraid our system is running slow today, so we'll have to take care of this at another branch," Victoria said coldly. The man, clearly puzzled and embarrassed, nodded meekly. It was clear to Amani that he had been subjected to this kind of treatment before. He had learned, like so many others, to just accept it and move on. But the man didn't leave. Instead, he stood still for a moment, looking over his shoulder at the young girl in the corner. Their eyes met briefly, and Amani saw the recognition in his face. He had seen this before. He had experienced this before. Without a word, the elderly man nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of the shared pain of being marginalized. Just then, Victoria's phone rang again, and she stepped away from the counter. Amani watched as she spoke in a hushed tone, trying to act as though nothing was wrong, but the urgency in her voice was unmistakable. She paced around the room, looking flustered, even more than before. Her eyes darted around, occasionally glancing toward the corner where Amani stood. The moment she turned her back, Amani noticed something strange. Victoria seemed to be preparing for something. At exactly 3:15 p.m., the glass doors of the bank opened again. This time, a sleek, black Mercedes S-Class glided into the parking lot and stopped directly in front of the entrance. The driver emerged with an air of practiced precision, moving quickly to open the rear passenger door. As the door swung open, a tall man emerged, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. His every movement screamed authority. "Is that?" Amani's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the man. "Mr. Wells," one of the bank associates whispered under his breath, staring at the figure in awe. "What's he doing here?" Amani's stomach churned. Harrison Wells. The name that had been mentioned earlier by her father, the CEO of Meridian Banking Group, one of Hancock Trust's main competitors. Amani's eyes locked onto Wells as he entered the building, his expression cold, calculating. It seemed that Victoria's earlier nervousness had been related to his arrival. Inside, Wells walked confidently toward Victoria's office, and for a moment, Amani caught a glimpse of something through the crack in the door. Victoria and Wells were speaking in hushed tones, their words lost in the thick air of the room. But Amani didn't need to hear the words. She could see everything she needed in their body language, the careful secrecy, the eager anticipation. Something was unfolding, and it didn't look good for her father's company. As they continued to talk, Amani's pulse quickened. She couldn't just stand there anymore. This was bigger than a simple transaction. She had stumbled upon something much more dangerous: corporate espionage, a deliberate betrayal aimed at destroying her father's hard-earned success. Her notebook was in her hands once again. Her pen moved across the pages, documenting everything she saw: the private meeting between Wells and Victoria, the folder labeled Montgomery Acquisition, and the plans they were discussing. Amani's hand shook, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She had to get this information out. She had to make sure it wasn't buried. Minutes passed in tense silence, and Amani kept writing, her heart hammering in her chest. When she was done, she looked up and found her gaze locked with Melody's across the room. The young teller was looking at her now, her expression a mix of fear and determination. It was clear Melody knew something had shifted. Amani was no longer just the victim of this system. She was a force to be reckoned with. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted. The normal hustle and bustle of a weekday afternoon had evaporated, replaced by a quiet tension that everyone seemed to feel but no one dared acknowledge. Amani could see it in the employees' eyes, the discomfort, the way they darted glances toward her as if she were some kind of threat. But in that moment, she realized something: she was the one in control now. Her father had said to trust him, and she did. She had done everything she could, documenting each moment, each sliver of truth that could expose what was happening inside Hancock Trust. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about all the people who had been quietly, systematically mistreated. It was about holding those in power accountable, no matter how daunting the task. She had watched as Victoria, now frazzled, tried to maintain an air of control, but the mask was slipping. She was no longer the cool, confident manager, but a woman on the edge, desperately trying to cover her tracks. The more she paced, the more agitated she became, until it was clear to everyone that something was unraveling. Amani's heart was still racing, but her mind was clear. She knew what had to happen. She just had to wait. At precisely 3:42 p.m., the bank's glass doors opened once more. This time, it wasn't just the arrival of one powerful figure, it was a procession. Dr. Josiah Montgomery's sleek black car pulled up right in front of the entrance, and several luxury vehicles followed. The crowd inside the bank visibly shifted. It wasn't every day that such a grand entrance was made in the small Oakridge branch. Amani's eyes widened when she saw her father step out of the car. His tall frame, poised and dignified, was unmistakable. He moved with deliberate calm, exuding an air of quiet authority. But even from across the room, Amani could see the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. He had been betrayed, and now, he was here to make sure the truth came to light. As Dr. Montgomery entered the bank, the staff stiffened. Their eyes darted to him, some exchanging nervous glances, others visibly shrinking under his gaze. Even the security guard who had escorted Amani across the floor now seemed to cower, stepping back as if he could feel the weight of the moment. Dr. Montgomery's gaze swept across the bank. He wasn't here to make a scene, he was here to make a statement. His eyes found Amani almost immediately. She was standing in the same corner, but now, with the arrival of her father, she felt the immense weight of the situation. This was no longer about her being mistreated. This was about what had happened to her, to people like her, and the systemic abuse that needed to end. "Amani," Dr. Montgomery called, his voice carrying across the room. "Are you all right?" Amani's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to run to him, but she couldn't. Instead, she nodded, her voice steady. "I'm okay, Dad." Dr. Montgomery's expression softened for a moment, but then, as if on cue, his eyes hardened once more. "Victoria Hargrove," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "We need to talk." Victoria froze. The air seemed to shift, and the bank's atmosphere grew more suffocating with each passing second. She had been caught, and she knew it. Dr. Montgomery, Victoria said, her voice cracking with an edge of panic. I wasn't aware your daughter was involved in this. I assure you, we were just following protocol. You were following protocol? Dr. Montgomery interrupted, his tone rising only slightly but with enough force to silence her. Protocol for who? For people like my daughter. Your protocol is nothing more than a convenient excuse for bigotry. He turned to the employees watching, the ones who had witnessed the entire scene unfold. Is this how you treat all your customers? Do you make assumptions based on the color of their skin? Is this the standard of service at Hancock Trust Bank? Victoria's eyes darted nervously around the room. I didn't mean for things to go this far, she stammered. It was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Dr. Montgomery repeated. You didn't just humiliate my daughter, you harassed her. You targeted her because of her race and her age. You subjected her to hours of torment, suspicion, and scorn without reason. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate choice. As Victoria's face grew pale, Dr. Montgomery turned toward the security camera footage, which had been silently recording everything. I suggest you review the footage, he continued, his voice unwavering. You'll see the entire story unfold. The cruel treatment. The preferential treatment given to other customers. The selective service based on race. And the meeting in your office with Harrison Wells, the man you've been conspiring with. The bank staff, including Melody, watched in silence, their faces a mix of shock and guilt. Amani could see it in their eyes, they had known something was wrong but had done nothing to stop it. Now, they were witnessing the consequences of standing by in the face of injustice. As Dr. Montgomery's words hung in the air, a figure entered the room. It was Miss Larkin, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She had been present during the entire ordeal, but now, she seemed to have arrived for a specific purpose. Dr. Montgomery, she said, her voice calm but firm, I'm with Hancock Financial Group's legal department. I've been informed of the situation and have been asked to conduct a thorough review. Your daughter's documentation, as well as the security footage, will be included in the investigation. Dr. Montgomery nodded. I'm glad to hear that. This kind of behavior has no place in any institution, let alone one that claims to offer banking services for all. It's time for change. At that moment, the security doors opened once more, this time to reveal a group of federal agents, financial crimes investigators who had been tipped off about the corporate espionage taking place at Hancock Trust. The agents moved quickly, their presence commanding. Without missing a beat, they stepped toward Victoria Hargrove and Harrison Wells. Ms. Hargrove, one of the agents said, his voice low and stern. You're under arrest for corporate espionage, fraud, and discrimination. Please step away from the counter. Victoria's face drained of color as she turned to Harrison Wells, who was now visibly sweating. He had been caught. There was nowhere to run. We've been monitoring your activities for some time, the agent continued. Your collaboration with Mr. Wells here, your attempts to sabotage Hancock Trust Bank, and your discriminatory actions, these are all part of an ongoing investigation. As the agents moved to arrest both Victoria and Harrison, the bank fell silent. There were no whispers anymore, no hushed conversations. Just the sound of the agents reading their rights and taking the criminals away. Amani stood tall, watching as the people who had once made her feel so small were led out of the building in handcuffs. She had done it. She had stood up to them, and in doing so, she had exposed the corruption and bias that had festered beneath the surface. Dr. Montgomery walked over to her, his face a mix of pride and relief. You did great, Amani. I'm proud of you. She smiled, her exhaustion beginning to fade as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. I didn't do it alone, Dad. I had help. And we've still got a long way to go. Her father nodded. Yes, we do. But today, you made a difference. Today, you showed them what justice looks like. 3 months later, Westridge Academy was buzzing with energy. Students filed into the auditorium, their excited voices filling the air. At the podium stood Amani Montgomery, no longer the girl forced to stand in a corner, but a confident young woman with purpose and determination in her eyes. Financial knowledge isn't just for adults or the wealthy, Amani's voice carried through the room, clear and strong. It's power, and everyone deserves access to that power, regardless of their age, background, or how much money their family has. The applause that followed was loud and enthusiastic. Amani had turned her painful experience into something bigger than herself, something that could change the lives of many others. Her journey had been difficult, but it had made her stronger, wiser, and more determined to make a difference. As the story of Victoria Hargrove and Harrison Wells made headlines, Amani knew that the battle wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more injustices to address, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her voice, and nothing, could take that away.